All right. Thank you so much for your time. I'm excited to be here. This is with my colleague, Kyle Myers. He's on the line. He's at Harvard Business School. What our plan is probably 15 minutes into the presentation, we're going to take a pause and he can offer any responses to the participants. And then he'll join in at the end of the presentation to help respond to the discussants and when we open up to broader Q&A. Kyle's been the fearless leader on this project, so I'm really happy to have him on the line as well. I'm presenting from Eugene, Oregon in the upstairs of my house. I'm sure we're all in sort of our own unique makeshift home offices. And I have to disclose that there's a non-zero probability that one of my kids will disrupt this presentation in some way, shape, or form. But hopefully I can get through it without too much of a distraction. What I wanted to do was to first start with a little bit of background and motivation as to what prompted Kyle and I to work on this project in the first place. Both of us served on the National Academy of Sciences congressionally mandated review of the Department of Energy's SBIR STTR program. As part of this service work, we were tasked to be on the subcommittee to evaluate the innovative outcomes of this project. And as part of this, we were trying to learn quite a bit about how this program is set up. So formally for the SBIR, it's housed under the Small Business Administration, the SBA. But there's 11 participating mission agencies and quite a bit of heterogeneity as to how these programs manage these proposals and allocate funds to the various firm applicants. However, there's one phrase that really jumped out to us, which I'm underlining here, that's made sort of right up present on the front webpage: search open funding topics. To my surprise, I hadn't realized that some of the mission agencies, DOE in particular, they allocate their R&D funds towards specific technology spaces. So you can think about it in so many words as trying to move the visible hand in a way that moves the market towards certain sort of innovative frontiers. And we wanted to take this framework into consideration as we set up our research design to evaluate the innovative returns from these federal investments. So broadly, excuse me, I'm having a little bit of a technical glitch, just a moment. Research subsidies are a key mechanism that governments worldwide rely on to promote innovation. This is response to the notion that private firms will likely underinvest in research relative to the social optimum. So every year, the federal government allocates roughly $13 billion per year by way of R&D contracts and grants to firms. And effectively, they're saying, here are these funds. We want you to invent a new technology X. So we went back to, I'm so sorry, I'm having sort of just a bit of a technological glitch. Just a moment. Thank you for your patience. Okay. So we went back to the existing literature and found that a lot of evaluations of R&D programs are in fact technology agnostic. And a lot of these studies really examine participating firms. So you take that firm recipient that received the R&D funds, try to construct the most comparable counterfactual, and estimate the difference in terms of inventive output between the two, and then you attribute that difference to the public investments. But when we think about how the federal program is set up, it really pushed us to rethink what might be the most appropriate research design for this study. And we started asking a number of questions. First, what is the cost effectiveness of targeted R&D grants if the grant recipients don't always invent what we want? So these R&D funds are directed toward these early stage high-tech firms, and they may pivot over the course of their R&D activities and sort of deviate from what they originally proposed to what they ultimately produce. So how can we take into consideration sort of this breadth of technological activity? Moreover, what's the cost effectiveness of targeted R&D grants if non-grant recipients invent what we want? So if the whole point of the program is to move the market in a certain direction, how can we identify those specific technology spaces to see whether or not there's activity that is in direct alignment with the federal funding call? Do we care what is invented or who is invented or who is inventing? So for the focus of this paper, effectively we want to put forth an evaluation of public R&D subsidies, and we really want to improve sort of the methodological approach. We argue not only should it consider whether investments spur particular firms to develop any technology, but in fact, we should also consider whether investments spur any firm to develop particular technologies, so those that are in direct alignment with the initial federal funding directive. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to estimate the marginal cost per patent. So if we increase the R&D subsidies by $1 additional, patents will increase in that given specific technology area by X-fold. So this pushed us to look at two specific research questions. Specifically, how much does it cost the program to spur a patent that is closely aligned to the program's technological objectives? So here we might sort of relax the assumption that it needs to be an organization that's a direct recipient and to account for a broader set of firms. But conversely, how much does it cost the program to spur a patent that is of any kind of technology? So allowing for a little bit of flexibility with respect to what sort of the breadth of technology activity that's taking place. Keeping this in mind, we want to estimate what share of all US PTO patents generated by the program are awarded specifically to the SBIR grant recipients. And then again, if we relax that geographic constraint, how can we estimate the share of patents that are awarded to all US inventors and more broadly awarded to foreign inventors as well? I do want to note that we take no normative.
Hold on, guys. We have a little
stance on this.
Oh, Lauren, you're coming in and out. Why don't you pause for a second?
Okay.
1 sec.
So sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. It was just your voice pause. Let's try it again.
Okay, where from research questions, or just pick it up?
We got through the 2 questions, so I think you're good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so just in a quick sum up, Kyle and I are taking no normative stance. We're not prescriptive with this analysis. We just want to offer a positive map of costs. So in order to answer this question, it requires an appreciation of research spillovers. So these are factors that may amplify or suppress the impact of these subsidies, spanning factors including externalities, cumulative invention, incomplete contracts, technology markets, agglomerations, etc. But we want to look at spillovers across 2 specific trajectories. So the first one sort of tying back to one of the earlier slides, technological spillovers. So how can we set up a design where we account for the fact that a firm promises a new solar panel? Maybe this is in direct alignment to what was specified by the original funding directive, but in fact, they created a new light bulb component. Conversely, we want to think about geographic spillovers. So what happens if there's another firm that may not be a direct recipient of the program, but they use that light bulb component to in fact create a new solar panel that is in direct alignment with that initial federal funding directive? We employ a reduced form approach with minimal assumptions about how the funding can lead to inventions. So we build upon an existing set of scholarship to help inform this study, both in terms of theoretical motivation, but with respect to the empirical setup as well. So drawing upon extensive literature on spillovers, both theoretically and empirically. What we do, going back to sort of the structure of the program, is put forth a technology level production function, not a firm level production function. So we're building upon a handful of studies that have been moving in this direction. Our real task is to devise this crosswalk between the R&D dollars and what technology space they're invested in to that inventive output. So we draw upon an extensive literature on text-based metrics to help us build up this data set. And ultimately what we offer is another study to evaluate the SBIR program. And what I have highlighted here is one study. This is Sabrina Howell's work, published in AER a couple of years ago, where she looked at the Department of Energy's program, and she had actually applicants and their scores. So she set up a robust regression discontinuity design. What is of use to us? So we use a different methodological design, but we can use this study as a guidepost to support the plausibility of our results. So I'm going to pull her study back in at the end when I'm reporting the regression results so we can see how comparable our design is to hers. So now what I want to do is just jump into a summary of our approach and results. So for our setting, we look at the Department of Energy's SBIR program, and we take these federal opportunity announcements. So the program officers managing these funds draft these descriptions of the specific technology spaces they want to move the market in. And we need to map that sort of input into similar patent classes to be able to estimate the output of patent activity. We restrict the time frame from 2006 to 2017, and this really has to do with data availability at the beginning of our time frame. For the research design, we leverage some of my prior work that uses the state-based SBIR non-competitive match program. So effectively, among those that are federal recipients, if you happen to be located in a state that has this non-match program, it offers an improved sort of exogenous allocation of R&D funds to those participating in the program. We impose data-informed bounds of technology and geographic spillovers to ultimately compare the cost per patent metrics when different patents count. And so what I'd like to do at this point is to sort of give a little bit of a, jump forward 30 minutes. So with respect to the results, if we only care about producing patents that are highly similar to what is specified by the federal funding directive, it will cost about 4 to 7 times more than if you're more technology agnostic and sort of open to a broader breadth of technology output. Moreover, SBIR participants only produce about 20% of net patents associated with this program. So we may underestimate if in fact we just focus on those that are direct recipients. And this activity isn't taking place everywhere. So less than 10% of US counties are responsible for most spillovers with this program. All right. So what I thought would be useful at this point is just to provide sort of the broad empirical model, and then we'll get a bit more into the weeds in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So ultimately, we aim to estimate a negative binomial model that resembles a traditional log transformed Cobb-Douglas production function. Effectively, we want to relate the annual flow of patents to the stock of R&D investments. So in order to do this, we need to set up not a firm level analysis, but in fact, a technology level data set. And so we're using the patent classification scheme as specified, the cooperative patent classification scheme, to identify specific technological spaces. For output, we look at patent activity. And again, we use the fact that every patent in the USPTO database, they are assigned to pre-assigned technology classes. We then one notable lift is we have to identify a crosswalk between the R&D allocation of the initial funding, that input, to those specific technologies. So we need to translate the stock of R&D grants to specific technology spaces. We draw upon the non-competitive state match to improve identification for this model. And this really is due to the fact that the federal allocation of funds is endogenously allocated. And so we need to use this to improve the design setup. And lastly, we incorporate both technological and geographic spillovers to assess how sort of what is produced takes place across these two different trajectories. And at this point, what I want to do is just pause briefly and let Kyle jump in if there's any specific questions.
No questions at this point, so chug on, Lauren.
Okay, I will keep going. Yeah, and thank you for bearing with me. I practiced ahead of time, and of course, technology is failing on me at this point, but the show must go on. All right, so here is an overview of the various data sets, and I do want to note that all of them are publicly available. And so we pull the full list of SBIR awards from sba.gov. And this includes not only the firm recipient, but importantly, the specific sort of technology space that was specified by the initial federal funding directive with the Department of Energy. So this is the federal opportunity announcements. What we also have, and the Department of Energy was kind enough to provide the PDFs of this detailed text, is the full 5 to 10 paragraphs specifying for every funding call how they're allocating these funds and what specific technology spaces they're trying to direct these investments. I've been tracing the non-competitive state match since 2013, and I've made this data publicly available. It's actually listed in Harvard's Dataverse. We pull the full corpus of patents from patentsview.org. So this is the USPTO records. In order to trace geographic spillovers, we look at travel costs. And so we draw upon data available from the Department of Transportation and IRS driving costs. And I'll get into more detail on that shortly. And we also augment the data set with county and state level indicators as specified by the US Cluster Mapping Initiative. So let's get into a little bit more detail with respect to our sort of input of R&D funds. So for the Department of Energy's SBIR program, every single dollar allocated as part of this program is tied to a targeted FOA topic. So these include topics like high performance networks, advanced fossil fuels research, remote sensing. In any given year, the DOE specifies 30 to 60 topics, and they fund roughly 6 phase 1 and 2 phase 2 awards. And I just want to take a brief moment to explain sort of the structure of this federal program. So this is, for the phase 1, it's competitively reviewed by the federal program, where these proposals have both commercial and technical merit. And of those that receive these funds, it's about $150,000 of non-dilutive funding for the small private firm to engage in the initial sort of proof of concept of that idea. Among those that receive the phase 1, you're then eligible to compete for the phase 2. And so this is a larger non-dilutive funding. It's about $1 million worth of investment for 2 years of support of the development of that project. What we need to do at this point is to take these targeted federal dollars and identify a specific technological space where they're trying to make these investments in order to connect our inputs with our outputs. So we look at patent activity as our outcome for a number of reasons. First, it's a programmatic goal of the SBIR program. Moreover, in pulling from patentsview.org, we can observe the full universe of inventive activity. And for every record, it has this pre-assigned class. So as I mentioned earlier, this cooperative patent classification scheme, which is effectively a hierarchy of labels, and it's very useful for indexing purposes. We want to use this effectively to identify very discrete technology spaces to tie our input of R&D dollars to our output of inventive production. So how do we construct this crosswalk between this input and output? We rely on a commonly used cosine similarity method to sort of map this overlap between these two bodies of text. In so many words, we're identifying very uncommon terms between what was specified in the initial federal investment and what was produced in terms of patent output to identify similarity between these two means. So let me just provide a little bit of detail. So we take the full set of FOAs from 2006 to 2017 as specified by the DOE. So here, here is one. Oh my gosh, I wish I didn't have technical issues, but it's all right. So we want to read these FOA topics and find similar patents that again share uncommon technical terms. But when we first run this crosswalk, we're looking among patent activity in the time frame prior to our time frame of interest. So we try to find similar patents between 2001 and 2004. What we're really paying attention to for these similar patents is these CPC classes. So these very discrete technology spaces to be able to identify a similarity in this federal R&D investment and this inventive output. Ultimately, what this enables us to do is to map the classes to FOA topics per patent similarity. So for each FOA, we estimate the most technologically similar CPC classes, but then once we have this crosswalk, we're able to calculate the value of grants awarded by way of FOA to similar classes among patent activity following these federal funding directives. So we look at activity then post funding calls. So here is a list of the top aggregate classes per federal dollar. And this is just, does it pass like our initial sort of sniff test? And we find, as we might expect, the DOE is investing areas we might expect them to prioritize. So this includes topics like basic electrical elements, basic electronic circuitry, electric communication techniques. So finding that where we might expect them to invest, in fact, this cosine similarity is picking up in those technological spaces. All right. So now I want to talk briefly about another component of our design, and it's how do we begin to account for geographic spillovers? And so ultimately what we want to estimate are concentric circles around the grant recipients. But importantly, we're not looking at geographic distance. We argue that human travel constrains the flow of ideas more so than just sort of the bird's eye flight between two areas. So we compute the cost of travel between every county pair within the US. So this, we need to rely on data from the NBER, IRS Standard Mileage Rate Program, and the Department of Transportation's Airline Origin Destination Survey. Ultimately, we want to compute the minimum cost of round trip travel between every county dyad within the United States. So within LA and New York, of course, that would be a direct flight, but between Eugene and New York, what it would likely require is to drive up to Portland and then a flight over there. So some combination of either driving or flying. Okay, sorry as I bring the technology. Great, love it. So for now, I want to shift gears and talk a little briefly about the SBIR state match program. So again, I've been tracing this since 2013. I've spoken with many of these policymakers that manage this program. Here's just a snapshot of a few of them. Over our time frame of interest, we see an increase of state match adoption from 6 all the way up to 16. And actually there's a little bit of volatility where North Carolina and New Jersey, in fact, canceled the program for a couple of years due to state budgetary restrictions and then ultimately readopted it. We argue that this is a useful source for improving identification for our model because they manage it in a way that they offer non-competitive funds to those phase 1 grant recipients. And so I just want to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about how this program works. Certainly, states do not adopt this program randomly, but I want to place sort of this state level policy within the context of our study. This is an SBIR state match program. For our study, we're looking at the Department of Energy's SBIR program. That accounts for roughly 6% of the entire federal program. What these states are trying to do is to help accelerate these small firms, their R&D activity forward. They're trying to make these localized investments relying on the competitive review of the federal program. When I spoke with state policy makers, it's not a strategy of what FOA is listed and let us then adopt this program so we can target funds towards specific technology spaces of this one participating mission agency. We find no evidence that these states are managing these in any way, in a strategic way that's directly aligned with our specific study of interest. And we include a number of diagnostics to help validate this claim. One concern we have, however, is how are those firms that are receiving these additional funds using these resources as they engage in R&D? John Hardin, the executive director of the One North Carolina Small Business Fund, surveyed the non-competitive grant recipients in North Carolina and was kind enough to share the results of his survey with Kyle and I. What's reported here over on the right is, in fact, the majority of these firm recipients are investing their funds in the wages for their employees of the specific firm. We were concerned that they may be sort of investing a lot of these resources towards patent-related costs, but at least among this subset of recipients, it accounts for less than 5% of activity, which gives us further confidence in using this as our instrument. Kyle, any questions? Are we good?
No, I think just some little things in the Q&A about the CBC classes. I think Song raised an interesting point on the chat about endogeneity of what topics get selected to have money thrown at them. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we're worried about, which leads us to use the state match to try to circumvent some of those kinds of issues.
Okay. All right. Sorry to call you at it. Yeah, it's all real time. All right, I'll keep going. So here is the research design roadmap that sort of we want to tackle to help set up our ultimate empirical regression. We need to address the fact that there's endogeneity of the federal investment with this state-based match policy. And so I'll talk about that on the next slide. We also need to extend the variable construction to explore geographic spillovers. So how do we account for the fact that there are these other firms that are producing technology in similar tech spaces? And we also want to extend the model to explore technological spillovers. So what if we sort of relax the constraint of how highly aligned the patent is to the original funding directive? All right, let me come down here. So ultimately, what we argue is that the state non-competitive match offers a plausibly exogenous allocation of public R&D funds. And so we run a number of diagnostics to help confirm this claim. We find there's no difference in the federal allocation of the funds per capita in matching states, whether when they turn on the policy, off the policy, or the size of the match itself. I've spoken with a number of program officers across a number of the mission agencies with the federal program, and they were a bit offended when I asked them, do you care what states are doing? And they said, absolutely not. But even with those claims, we find that that checks out empirically as well. There's also a concern that do these firms pack up shop, move across state borders in order to sort of gain the benefits of this local R&D investment? And so we traced firm movement activity for not the 6% of the DOE program, but for 85% of the entire SBIR program. And we find no evidence of SBIR winning firms moving either into or out of states as a result of this state match policy turning on or off. So it is about $50,000 to $100,000. We find that it's just not enough to prompt firms to relocate to gain the benefits of this program. However, we now have a bit of a challenge. We have this exogenous addition of this state match, but we need to use it by multiplying it with this endogenous federal investment. And so ultimately what we want to do is to identify a windfall investment of the state match. So technically, we predict the average amount of state funds that each class would receive based on the flow of federal funds and the average matching policy at that time across all of the states. We then use deviations from this prediction as the instrument. And because we now have negative values, the log transformation is no longer applicable. So we demean this investment by dividing by the sample average. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to hold fixed the number of SBIR awards. And without changing any other policies, we want to estimate what would happen if the size of the public R&D subsidy increased. So effectively, we're estimating an intent to treat model, intent to treat effect. All right, so now we need to deal with identifying spillovers across geographic space. So here, operationally, we estimate separate regressions that increase the size of concentric circles of which patents are counted in the dependent variable. And so first, we only look at those patents that are specifically from SBIR grant recipients. And then ultimately what we want to do is we want to compare the implied marginal cost across multiple regression models as where the dependent variable successively includes patent output from firms that are further and further from that grant recipient. So we're increasing that travel cost band to ultimately sort of traverse the entire geography of the US. Then we want to sort of step it up onto a global stage, and we consider patent activities from inventors worldwide. I have this asterisk here because unfortunately we don't have detail to compute the travel costs beyond the US, so we look at this sort of as one set of geography. Ultimately, we want to compare the cost per marginal patent for these SBIR grant recipients relative to others to estimate the geographic spillovers. So I think it's useful to provide an illustrative example here. If it costs $1 million per patent from a grant recipient, and only $500,000 per patent from any inventor that also includes grant recipients, we would estimate that the net geographic spillover in this very simplified case is twofold, where SBIR recipients are only responsible for 50% of net output. All right. So now we face an even harder challenge. And so this is, how do we identify spillovers across technology space? We can't allow investment from each FOA, each of these original funding directives, to possibly affect all technologies. We want to search for some boundary where we begin to estimate a null effect. And so we begin with similarity scores where the FOA and the class are in high alignment with one another. And then we're going to relax that constraint to see where we ultimately estimate a null effect. And so here are the results where we use the state match windfall investment to search for a point where we can begin to estimate null effects. And it happens right around here at the 55% similarity threshold. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to compare the implied marginal costs within regression models. And we have multiple independent variables constructed based on the state match windfall investments made into technology classes that then move further and further away from the focal class, yet we cut it where it has to be at least 55% similar to the initial federal investment. All right. So what I like this slide, research design in English. So based on all of that, what are we trying to say? We set up a technology level production function. Again, this is not a firm level production function. We want to map federal funding opportunities onto patent classes. So this input of federal R&D dollars in specific technology spaces to inventive output in specific technology spaces. We identify the marginal costs using the non-competitive state SBIR match program. We ultimately estimate a negative binomial model and rely on the state match windfall investment as a measure of plausibly exogenous inputs. We implement a score bootstrap to account for both technology space and temporal correlations of the standard errors. And specifically, we look at more aggregate level of CPC classes and years to construct this. And we want to trace two specific forms of spillovers, both geography and technology, to estimate the cost of public funding on patent activities. So let me just reiterate again, for geographic space, this is not geographic distance, but in fact, travel cost over county level concentric circles from that original SBIR grant recipient. For technology space, we rely on the FOA to patent class similarity score. Okay, Kyle says I have 6 minutes, but I'm gonna pick it up. So we want to rely on that overlap to be able to estimate how closely aligned it is with the federal funding. All right, roadmap of results. So ultimately we have I want to report the geographic boundary cases and net technology spillovers. So what's the cost per patent if we count all patents that are grant recipients, US inventors, and worldwide inventors? And then we want to see how this appreciates across these two trajectories of both geography and technology space. And if time, and I think I can do it, I want to just briefly review some of the heterogeneity analyses. So where is this taking place? Which counties are most responsible for the effect? Are certain counties exploring versus exploiting what was specified by the federal funding directive? All right, 35 minutes in, let's get to some regression results. So here are the results of the geographic boundary case for grant recipients. So they are at least 55% similar in terms of technological orientation to the original federal funding call. I want to direct your attention here to columns 3. We're reporting both the elasticity and what I think is a more useful sort of interpretation is the cost in millions per additional patent or citation. So it costs $790,000 for a grant recipient to produce a patent that is at least 55% similar to the original funding call. It's slightly larger to produce an additional citation. If we didn't account for this state match windfall instrument, we would underestimate these costs, and that's not surprising given the endogenous allocation of the federal funds. Let's switch it now. Oh, and briefly, this falls right in line with what Sabrina estimated. Her estimates was between 150,000 to 1.5 million to spur an additional patent. So it's right within her estimates. Now let's put it on the worldwide sort of platform. It costs the government approximately $170,000 to produce an additional patent among all inventors that is at least 55% similar to the original funding call. So we see that these costs decrease when we increase sort of our geographic specifications. So this is my daughter's favorite slide in the entire presentation. What I just reported here were these two boundary cases, but we want to show what happens when we sort of relax constraints from requesting that it be in high alignment of technical overlap and move it all the way down to 55% similarity, and then move further and further away from that grant recipient. So in terms, oh, I just wish I didn't have this technical glitch, but so I want to direct your attention across this x-axis here when we're thinking about technology spillovers. Again, what we're doing here is we're comparing the implied marginal costs within regression models. So we have about 9 independent variables constructed based on the state match windfall investments made into technology areas that are further and further away from the focal class. Here for the grant recipient, it's about $5.4 million that the federal government needs to invest such that that grant recipient produces a patent that is at least 95% similar to the original funding call. But that drops down to $790,000. And so I want you to sort of compare between all of these different specifications, and we find that high match patent costs are about 4 to 7 times more than match agnostic patents. So in terms of geographic, over here, I want you to now sort of compare along the y-axis. So what we're doing here is we're comparing the implied marginal cost across regression models where the DV successively includes patent output from firms that are further and further away from the grant recipient. Comparing sort of at this boundary case to here, we find that the US patents cost about 3 to 4 times less than grant recipients, and that it's even greater sort of cost reductions, 4 to 5 times less if we look at the worldwide platform. Another way to look at these results, so the share of net output. So who's producing this activity? And I want to direct your attention over here to this sort of bound. We find that grant recipients are responsible for about 20% of net patents. Within the US, that's about 75% of all activity that is at least 55% similar to the original funding call. And so this domestic foreign split is about 25-75. We run this a handful of ways, but I'm just going to sort of fly through this because I don't have time, but we can come back. So the summary of the results: how much does it cost the program to spur a patent? If it's closely aligned to the program's technological objectives, it's anywhere from $700,000 to $5 million per patent. But what if it is of any kind of technology? It costs anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million per patent. What would I tell the public in this case? It costs more than we thought to invent specific things. So if you want to move in a specific technological space. Conversely, what share of all USPTO patents generated by the program are awarded to grant recipients? 20%. We bump it up to the US bound 75, and awarded to foreign inventors 25. What would I say to the public? It costs less than we thought to get anyone to invent things. So with about 2 or 3 minutes to spare, I want to just quickly go through where is this activity taking place? Which counties are responsible for these spillovers? And so there's actually only a handful of areas within the US where we have sort of the largest spillovers. These are all of the main players we might expect. So Santa Clara includes Palo Alto, King County includes Seattle, San Diego, Travis is where Austin, Texas is. So it's just this handful of specific geographies that are accounting for a disproportionate amount of activity. Where is this funding going? I just wanted to show a map that we find the spillovers are actually highly aligned with where these investments are taking place. So there's this close co-location. But we want to look a little bit more closely as to how do these counties generate spillovers? Do they explore? So are they pushing that technological boundary further away from that initial funding call? Or are they really trying to exploit and produce patents in high alignment? So we construct a county's exploit index, merely just looking at the sort of ratio of the cost of spurring any patent to high patent activity. And again, the areas where we might expect the real innovative clusters, they fall on sort of the left side of the explore continuum. So again, San Francisco, New York, the Bay Area, and Seattle. But on the other side, Schenectady, New York sort of stands out as a bit of an outlier, where they efficiently produce activity that is in high alignment with what is specified by the federal program. We looked into this area more closely and found, in fact, there's a private-public partnership focused on the energy sector, which sort of makes sense that they're producing things that are so aligned with the initial funding directive. And again, those cities that I just flagged are more efficient than most in producing these outcomes. So if I can take 2 more minutes, Mike, if that's all right. He gives me the nod. Okay, summary of results. So we argue this activity isn't taking place everywhere. 5 to 10% of counties are responsible for most spillovers. But what predicts the rate and direction of these spillovers? So we run a series of lasso regressions, drawing upon the detail from the cluster mapping data. And we find that pre-sample patenting rates and VC investments are associated with higher sort of levels of activity. And what accounts for the direction? So those that have a more exploratory orientation, it's both of those indicators in addition to employment. What are the broad takeaways from this county level exercise? We find more evidence that's in alignment with the prior literature, that SBIR and VCs are complements of one another. The most productive counties are more exploratory, so pushing the bounds of that technological frontier, and the government may need to trade off influence over the rate and direction. So last slide. What we really want to put forth with this study is a novel research designed to examine spillovers. And we want policymakers to think more comprehensively how you might want to understand and measure the innovative returns of these investments. We find the magnitude suggests that the social returns to the SBIR could be 3 times more than private returns, and this is in alignment with prior studies. Relative to technology agnostic firm level evaluations of research grants, it probably cost the government more than we thought to invent specific things, yet less than we thought to invent anything. And so for program evaluation, we would say what should you make with this? It really depends among policymakers on how seriously you want to target the nature of these grants. And so whether or not you care more about tracing those that get the funds versus trying to move towards specific technological spaces. Time always moves faster in real time. So we're going over a few minutes.
Just for that. Yeah. So Mike told me let's go directly into discussion. So let's go directly into discussion. 2 main points. The first one is to put the paper in literature. In particular on the spillover side, a lot of things are missing. On the ecological specification, I exchanged a lot with the authors who were kind enough to indulge my lack of comprehension. So I will go briefly on that. So just on the contribution, the paper is clearly about spillovers, and so what do we know already? And we know quite a lot, and a lot of it is missing in the paper. So we know that spillover exists, and having estimated multiple dimensions, the state level, the county level, the commuting zone level, the technology classes. One thing that appears over and over again is that, in particular, when we think about geography, a very robust finding is that knowledge actually do not travel well. So typically, whether it is in Europe, in US, in other contexts, the distance is between 100 and 400 miles. There is a paper by Berry. I have one. There is this really nice paper by Belenzon and Sharon in the research showing that the knowledge seems to stop, the spillover seems to stop at the state border. And so, one reason for why it does happen is that knowledge spillovers, they have to be conveyed through something, through a channel. And the main channel seems to be employees moving from one firm to the other. And we know that people usually move within the county. They don't travel a lot. And so the result that the authors have, which is that basically there is no drop in the spillovers depending on how big the travel costs are, I find it very, very bizarre and surprising. On the other thing of the other part of the paper is trying to exploit this county heterogeneity. And so just one thing I would like to point here is that, again, that has been studied in the past. People have insisted on the importance of having education, a larger education base. Going back to this problem of why exactly knowledge travel and whether it is going through employees moving. There is this debate regarding whether non-compete laws may prevent precisely those knowledge to spread across firms. And, there's all this debate in the literature regarding the upside or the downsides of non-compete covenants. And there has also been some work on the availability of venture capital. Okay, so on the econometric specification, the main thing I want to point at, we discussed that, so let me go through, let me skip this part. The one thing I want to mention here is the following. So the authors are doing this split regression to estimate the spillovers, where they are going to say, okay, we are going to define beams of either technological proximity or distance or travel time, and we're going to estimate different regressions for each beam. So the very nice thing, and that I think it's really pretty fantastic, is that the big pro that allows you to estimate in non-parametric way the spillovers. So in a sense, it is way more transparent to estimate the spillover this way, precisely because that allows you to produce this figure that I find really, for me, that's one of the main, the most amazing figures you have in the paper, which then you really see that there is this massive decline indeed. And so using a linear specification will probably does not give you, will not inform you a lot here. The big cons I see, and so I think that probably relates a bit to some of the questions that Song had, which is that you make this big point about trying to compare geography with technology, but the problem is that given there is a lot of collocations, we know that some of the tech stuff are concentrated in Palo Alto, some of the biotech are concentrated in Boston. It makes it very hard actually to identify the two separately unless you run them together. And so, it's very hard for me to interpret even, this nice map that you had, this heat map that you had with those two ways cost estimate, given that potentially when you estimate geographical spillover, you are estimating, technological spillovers and vice versa. So the only way to address this point would be just to have the two spillovers in the same regression and to see which one loads the most when you look at the effect on patent. What you want to do at the end of the day, I think, is to estimate the effect of patent in technology class S in state I, in state S at time t, over both the shock that is happening at the technological class level and the shock that is happening at the state level. So just to finish here, the one thing I wanted to finish with is that your instrument is biased, but it's not your instrument. Anyone who tries to estimate spillover with this kind of specification are going to face an issue of having a biased instrument. So even if your shock is perfectly exogenous, you are facing the following problem, that you have an instrument for the intensity of the treatment. The problem is that because you are aggregating everything at the technological class level, you don't have an instrument for the entry. And so, let's say this is spill test, and this is the overall amount of spillovers that you will have in a given technological class. This can be decomposed into the following term, which is that this is going to be the overall shock that is perfectly exogenous, so I'm not debating that. That applies to the amount of existing firm between t-1 and t. The problem is that is also, the overall shock is also coming from the shock that new firms are going to have, minus the shock that old firms that are disappearing from the data sets used to have. And so those two terms here are not instrumented, and actually they're going to be very endogenous with, technological class booms. There is a boom in biotech, for instance. You have more firms entering, so you will have more patents here in the biotech technological class, and there is also more firms that are going to benefit from the treatment, such that when you aggregate everything, when you sum, all the firms that are benefiting from the exogenous program, you will have this overall bias whereby the shock here is going to have a positive increase. The pattern is going to have a positive increase just because the two are correlated with the technological boom that is happening in this specific technological class. Unfortunately, so the only way to address this problem is that you want to find a way to get rid of entry and exit, which is, of course, usually quite challenging. Given that you have a fairly limited time period, you might be able to try to find a way to limit this problem. So this is a discussion that I have in my paper on spillovers. And so, by the way, this is something that, for instance, the Broom-Schenkelman paper has this massive issue, the ECMA paper has this massive issue precisely because most of the results actually are driven by this entry-exit margin and not at all by the intensity of treatment margin. All right, the rest is okay. And yeah, finally, you have those heterogeneous comparison across counties. The one thing I need to point at is that depending on what you want to say, it's either okay or not okay, what you guys are doing. If you think of a policymaker, what the policymaker cares about is you want to predict where the elasticity of the spillover is going to be larger. And so, in this respect, what you are doing is absolutely perfect and is super, super useful. Then the question is, to what extent can we use those elasticities to understand something about what are the economic characteristics that are creating this variation in the spillovers? So it's a bit like the question that Song was asking. And so here you are facing an additional problem, which is that because you are running cross-sectional tests, you are reintroducing homogeneity in a sense, imagine, for instance, when you rank counties based on how much VC they have, they are also going to be correlated in terms of how much skilled workers they have, just to name one. And so then it's very unclear whether it is the VC that is increasing the spillovers or whether it is the fact that you have more skilled workers in the county that is increasing the spillovers. Anyway, here I would just encourage you to be a bit more precise in the sense of what exactly is the end game of the exercise. If it is purely from the point of view of the SBIR, I just care about where, when I send $1, I will have the biggest impact. This is perfect. If then you want to draw bigger policy conclusions in a sense, that might require additional instrument. And of course, it's hard, but at least trying to add some additional basic control, for instance, might go a long way to address these issues. Okay, Mike, I'm done.
All right, thank you guys. So like Lauren, I have like 2 dogs and 3 kids. So hopefully they will be quiet in the next 10 minutes, but I think the dogs are more likely to be quiet. But in any case, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you about this great paper. So I was requested not to say anything good, just to kind of focus on my comments because we don't have much time. So I really like the paper. I think it has tons of kind of great stuff. And I'm just going to focus on what I think can make this paper better. Many of the things are idiosyncratic stuff I care about. So, just check with other people whether you think, these comments make sense or not. But I'm going to, but the good news is that my comments are going to be roughly orthogonal and I think complementary to Adrien's comments. So you get a good sense of feedback on this paper. So this paper essentially, I view it as a public policy paper aiming at estimating the returns to SBIR grants and kind of investigating how these returns distribute across technology and geography. Really lots of stuff to love about the paper, very comprehensive, innovative methods, textual methods, and really a very serious attempt to address the major problem in public policy, which is, how do we deal with matching? How do we deal with endogeneity, unobservables? So they really did a great job. I'm going to, clearly there are reservations, and I think Adrien pointed out very interesting ones. I'm going to focus more on the potential solution I might have for you, something I personally like a bit more. So what I'm going to focus on is first empirical design. I'm going to make a big deal of the unit of analysis and your identification, which I think are related to each other. The textual analysis, I personally I spend a lot of time on these things. So maybe this is like the more kind of idiosyncratic part that I'm going to care about stuff that you might not really care about. So just, I would try to change the direction of technical change that you are following with these kind of comments. Hopefully you find them useful. And the framing. Also, I think the framing, I think what you're doing is really interesting and can become way more interesting than the way you frame it now as essentially a classical question, which has been addressed many times. I think you can do something more novel with the data and essentially ask the question of why should we expect to see an effect and not what is the size of the effect. And this is like, I'm going to talk about that at the end. So hopefully I have like 8 minutes based on my clock. If you need me to stop earlier, just let me know. So the first comment I'll say is that maybe one of the major concerns I have is about the unit of analysis, the way you kind of define an observation. First, it took me like 5 times to read the paper all over again to understand what collapse mean. Please be more specific. In any case, it is really based on some belief that we should put into your ability to textually match. Well, actually, I know that you have the ability to textually match FOA and pattern abstract. The question is what this matching means. So that's one obvious kind of issue is that observations are correlated, autocorrelated, because they're going to share the same text and you're going to use some arbitrary definition of when an observation stops and when a new observation begins. This is a big problem in my opinion, first with this. I know that you have a section discussing that, but this is an obvious thing I would say. And then the less obvious and much more important for me is what happens if you get it wrong? And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what is the best way to use textual methods to essentially answer questions which are related to you, to what you're asking, which is to what extent textual overlap really captures a semantic or technical similarity between documents. So there are essentially 2 ways to kind of think about the potential measurement error in K, or essentially how you allocate R&D funding to fields. The first one is classic. Basic idea is the textual boundaries, measurement error in the textual boundaries, or in essentially how we define an observation, is orthogonal to the dependent variable, which in your case is number of patterns. This is a classic measurement error. I'm less worried about that. But I think the big problem starts if we believe that there is a systematic measurement error in how we define fields, or more specifically our ability to accurately assign or match FOA and pattern abstracts. And I'll give you like two kind of just two examples to make this point. And obviously I'm going to, if I have time, I'm also going to give you some advice on a potential solution. I think it's taking a bit slower than I hoped, so I'll be just kind of move a bit faster. So one is something which I kind of found to be really important, which is the use of science. More scientific fields, or if you like, more mature fields where science is like well established. Think about like economics and strategy. In strategy, every paper can use any language they want, or maybe now a bit less by the beginning because the field is less established. In economics, where scientific methods have been around for a longer period of time, there is a sharper, kind of stronger kind of, your ability to choose how to describe things is much more limited, which means we might essentially see things that are really similar to each other using very different language. And the problem that you have is that how tight the textual domain is really potentially related to how mature the industry is, and this is clearly related to technological opportunities which are on the left-hand side. Other things, the other point I'd like to make is, again, I do not know much about that in your context, but I'm guessing that sometimes the FOA are well-defined. You know exactly what, so I just kind of Googled a bunch, now with COVID-19, you know exactly what these guys want us to kind of focus on. But in other cases, it might be a bit more speculative, open-ended. And your ability to essentially match patterns to those specific FOA might be related to the level of kind of speculative or how defined the research area is, and this might also be related to essentially technical opportunities as well. So these are like, all right. So hopefully it makes sense. Next points, conditioning on patenting. I'm going to talk about this. So patenting, because you condition on patenting both on the matching and also on the left-hand side, you are essentially reversing a version of patterns against patterns, which for me is always worrying. And also we have this issue of selection into patenting. which essentially leads to the kind of big, I think, comment here is, I'm not convinced that the ultimate outcome that you should observe or you should investigate is patenting. I've done some research with data we have from Duke about, say, SBIR grants and patenting. And patenting is not the major outcome that people have. So I think you should try to broaden the dependent variable a bit to maybe include scientific publications, maybe include starting up companies, raising funding, even licensing technologies, and many things that TLOs or TTOs would really care about. Right, so let me just kind of stop there. Universities, again, I'm talking from my personal experience, universities play a major role in partnering with companies and getting those SBIR grants. I did not see any discussion of that, and I think you should talk about this quite a bit more. So what I would do in your shoes, if I were writing this paper, I would do it at the firm level. So again, I don't want to kind of take too much time. But if you can do it in the firm level, no one's going to ask you what is the unit of analysis, easy to explain, and maybe the part is kind of the easiest one to kind of point out, which can really solve a big chunk of your problems. You can essentially look at shocks to other firms and use spillovers as a way to estimate the interesting stuff, but also as a form of identification. So instead of asking the question of what is the effect of SBIR grant on myself, asking the question of if other people get SBIR grants, what is the impact it might have on my innovativeness? And then as a function of how close I am, etc. So in this case, even if you don't do anything on the textual overlap, people are going to worry about it less because it's not like center front. You're not using it as a way to define your unit of analysis and observations, etc. Michael, how long do I have? I don't want to take too much. I have 5-6 more minutes. 1 minute? No. You said 1 minute?
Okay, 1.5.
No, right? No way. All right. So, okay. So, let me just skip that identification strategy. I think this is something that Adrien covered well, and if you want, we can talk about it offline. So in terms of the textual overlap, let me just, I don't have time to go over everything I wanted. Let me just tell you, like, there are 2 things which are really important, and please, Michael, I'm going to do it in 30 seconds. It's really hard. The first is your method assumes that if you use the word K and I use the word I, you will use dog, I use cat. They are essentially very different. Clearly, it's not the case that we need to find some conceptual relatedness between them. This is a classical problem that you need to think about. But the bigger thing, which I think the second issue, which is really important, and it's a more subtle issue. What is the relationship between distance and similarity, depending on whether you're similar or different? For example, what we find and what I see in many cases is that distance, textual distance might be informative to determine whether I'm different from Kyle. But if I'm different from Kyle, textual overlap doesn't really teach us much. And this is a very important point to think about. And I'm sorry we don't have much time. I'm happy to follow up with you later. So the best approach, in my opinion, to tackle this problem is to use essentially an FMM model, if you like, machine learning unsupervised approach, where you don't treat textual overlap as your dependent variable, but you treat it as an indicator into something that you don't observe. And this something is essentially how similar the 2 documents are. And you can use that textual overlap in addition to other indicators to really kind of really make a really progress in tackling those issues. And there are many other issues, smaller points here, which unfortunately I don't have time because I want to make sure you have time to respond. But how you do this textual stuff, I really hope you take it seriously because, in my opinion, this is something that we should do better in the future, all of us as a field. And let me just say the last thing. All right. So so 1 minute. Yeah. No, I don't have time. So look, we just published an HBS article that I think really kind of talks very nicely about what Kyle and Ryan do. So I will not go over it now because I don't have time. But if you're interested, just read this stuff. The point is that we really need governments to intervene in physical sciences because for some reason the market doesn't work well in that space. And there's like lots of kind of potential other vehicles, governments, but also cyclotron Roy is from Berkeley, the one we started from from Cornell. All these programs exist because VCs are not willing to fund those programs. And I think instead of asking how much we get, ask why life sciences need the help, but life sciences and life sciences and ICT do not. And I think you can tell a really interesting story that will take you away from this old question of, okay, if I give you $1, how much you are going to get back? I think it's much more relevant, and hopefully, we can follow up on the discussion on this later. So, Michael, I apologize if I took more time.
No worries. Thank you, Sharon. You're reminding me why I'd be a horrible dean or chair because I can't say no. So you guys got about 5 minutes. Kyle and Lauren, I'll hand it off to you, and then I'll wrap up real quick.
Great. So I'll take the floor for a minute. Thanks again to Adrien and Sharon for those great comments. That was super useful, and we'll definitely be following up. I think, Adrien, you were totally spot on that, like, in a single regression is exactly where we wanted to go. We just can't cut the data fine enough to estimate it like that. And the firm entry exit thing seems super interesting. I'm not entirely sure that we don't want that in there if we're because we're trying to just be very this is a black box, money goes in and patents come out. And if part of that is the firm churn, then that might be okay. But I mean, if we can figure out how much of that is okay, but I'm super intrigued and see if we can unpack that and figure out what we need to do there. And Sharon, yes, Tim was starting to bring up some of the similar points in the Q&A online. I think figuring out it's unclear that there's what the test is to tell if you've done this right. But so I think our goal will be to try to come up with as many of these feasible ways of building these kind of linkages that seem well motivated, and hope that the cost estimates are similar, or if they're different, then hopefully there'll be some signal as to why certain things work and certain things don't. I think the finite mixture model stuff in particular seems super interesting as a way forward. But like I said, we'll follow up with you too. Thank you again for the help, and we'll open the floor for any questions from anyone else.
I think we've got everything. So if anyone has questions, we will be on this. I suspect the authors will be happy to take those over email. The paper is posted on the website. So I'll end with that. First off, thanks everyone, discussants and presenters. Let me just quickly share my screen to remind everyone what is coming up next. So in 2 weeks, we have a paper called Value Without Employment by Simcha Barkai from LBS. He'll be presenting on the 15th. The RSVP is open. And if you haven't already, submit your paper. There's the call for papers. Just submit it to this email address. We'll probably take a little break in July for the workshop, but we hope to continue in the fall. So don't hesitate to just submit it when you're ready. We like early work. So again, thanks everyone. Thanks to our discussants and presenters, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.